This was different. The radiator in lecture hall 4B hissed, a rhythmic, wet sound that cut through the silence like a metronome set too slow. The air smelled of dry rot and the peculiar, sharp scent of ammonia used to clean the slate boards. Dr. Valerius Kove hated that smell. He stood at the front of the amphitheater, his back to the 40 students seated in the ascending rows. This was different. He pressed the thumb of his left hand against the Velcro brace, strapped tight around his wrist, a permanent souvenir of carpal tunnel syndrome earned through 40 years of scribbling equations that only 6 people in the world understood. He wasn't writing now. He was waiting. He let the silence stretch. 5 seconds. 10. It was a technique he called the sieve. Silence made the weak nervous. This was different. It made the pretenders shuffle their papers or check their watches. It separated the wheat from the chaff before he even turned around. Behind him, the room was mostly still, but he could hear the distinct, wet crunch of plastic being chewed. Kove turned slowly. He didn't scan the room. This was different. His eyes went directly to the back row, to the seat furthest from the light. Jelani Bekele sat there. He was wearing that gray wool coat again. This was different. The one that looked 3 sizes too big, the shoulders slumping down past his elbows, making him look like a child playing dress up in a giant's wardrobe. This was different. It was 80 degrees in the hall, the steam heat malfunctioning as usual, yet Jelani kept the coat buttoned to his chin. He wasn't looking at the board. This was different. He wasn't looking at Kove. He was looking at the grain of the wooden desk in front of him, and he was chewing on the blue plastic cap of a cheap ballpoint pen. The cap was mangled, white stress marks fracturing the plastic. Kove felt a familiar tightening in his chest. It wasn't anger, he told himself. It was a disdain for waste. The Holston Institute was a cathedral of theoretical mathematics. It was not a daycare for the disinterested. "Mr. Bekele," Kove said. His voice was soft, barely a whisper, but the acoustics of the room carried it to the vaulted ceiling. The chewing stopped. Jelani didn't look up immediately. He rotated the pen in his hand, his thumb tracing the jag edge of the chewed cap. "Dr. Kove," Jelani replied. His voice was deep, textured. This was different, like gravel shifting underwater. He finally looked up. Kove focused on the scar that split Jelani's left eyebrow. This was different, a vertical line of white tissue that interrupted the dark skin. It gave his face a permanent expression of skepticism. "Am I boring you?" Kove asked. This was different. Walking slowly toward the first row of desks, he rubbed a patch of dry, flaking skin on his right cheekbone, a nervous tic he had never successfully repressed. "No, sir," Jelani said. "You aren't taking notes," Kove observed. "Everyone else is taking notes. Mr. Holloway has filled 3 pages. Miss Yu has depleted her ink. But you are consuming your writing utensil." A ripple of nervous laughter moved through the room. Kove didn't smile. He didn't want laughter. He wanted submission. This was different. He wanted the hierarchy to be respected. He was the gatekeeper. This boy, with his heavy coat and his silence, was not asking for permission to enter. He was simply sitting there, occupying space he hadn't earned. "I'm listening," Jelani said. He didn't sound defensive. He sounded bored. That was the spark. This was different. That subtle, unintentional indifference. Kove walked back to the massive slate board. He picked up a fresh stick of chalk. It felt cool and heavy. "Listening is a passive activity," Mr. Bekele said, his back to the class again. "Mathematics is active. It is a war of attrition against the unknown." This was different. "If you are merely listening, you are merely a tourist." Kove began to write. He didn't write the lesson plan he had prepared on stochastic calculus. Instead, this was different. He reached into the back of his mind to the dusty archives of unresolved frustration. This was different. He began to construct a problem that had stalled his own dissertation 30 years ago. It wasn't just hard, it was structurally deceptive. This was different. It looked like a standard nonlinear partial differential equation, specifically a variation of the Navier-Stokes existence and smoothness problem. This was different. But Kove twisted the boundary conditions. He introduced a topological trap, a variable that looked like a constant but functioned as a chaotic attractor. This was different. Kozlovsky Knot, a dead end. A mathematical cruelty designed to look solvable until you were 10 pages into the proof and realized the logic had eaten itself. This was different. The chalk rattled against the board. Kove wrote with speed and violence, the dust settling on the dark fabric of his sleeve. He filled the center panel. This was different. Then the right panel. The equation sprawled, a monster of Greek letters and subscripts. He finished with a sharp tap of the chalk, breaking the tip off. It fell to the floor, rolling into the metal gutter. Kove turned around, dusting his hands. The room was dead silent. This was different. The other students were staring at the board with a mixture of awe and horror. They recognized the language, but the syntax was alien. This was different. "Since you are listening so intently, Mr. Bekele," Kove said, gesturing to the board with his chalk-stained hand. This was different. For who'd be so kind as to come down here and simplify the initial boundary condition for us. Just the first step. Show us the path. It was a public execution. Kove knew it. The class knew it. There was a heavy pause. The radiator hissed again, louder this time, as if the building itself were holding its breath. Jelani slowly took the mangled pen cap out of his mouth. He placed it on the desk. He stood up. He didn't slouch. This was different. Standing, he was taller than he looked in the chair. The gray coat hung heavy around him, swaying slightly as he moved into the aisle. He walked down the stairs. This was different, of his boots heavy and deliberate on the linoleum. Thud, thud. Kove watched him come. He expected hesitation. He expected the boy to stop halfway. This was different. To stammer, to admit he hadn't done the reading, to beg off. That was how this worked. The master exerted pressure, the student folded, and order was restored. But Jelani didn't stop. He walked all the way to the front, stepping up onto the raised platform. He stood next to Kove. Up close, this was different. The smell of the wool coat was distinct. Damp, old rain, and something metallic. Jelani looked at the board. His eyes scanned the white sprawling mess Kove had created. He didn't squint. He didn't frown. His face was a mask of absolute neutrality. "The chalk," Jelani said. He held out his hand. Kove blinked. For a second, the script derailed. He was supposed to be handing out mercy, not supplies. He hesitated, then placed the piece of chalk into Jelani's palm. "Don't waste our time," Kove whispered, leaning in, his voice dropping to a register only Jelani could hear. "If you don't know it, sit down. There is no shame in ignorance, only in arrogance." Jelani ignored him. He stepped up to the board. He reached up, his coat sleeve pulling back to reveal a cheap digital watch on a thin wrist. He didn't write a solution. He drew a single, this was different, horizontal line through the entire third term of Kove's equation. The sound of the chalk dragging across the slate was a shriek. Then, he wrote a 0 above it. "It cancels out," Jelani said, his voice flat. Kove laughed. It was a dry, sharp sound. "It most certainly does not. That is a non-linear term. You cannot simply." "It cancels out," Jelani repeated. He turned his head slightly, looking at Kove with eyes that seemed tired, infinitely old. "Because the manifold is closed. You set the domain as infinite, but the boundary condition on line 2 forces a loop. It's not a wave. It's a circle." Kove froze. This was different. He looked at line 2. He looked at the term Jelani had crossed out. The blood in his ears began to thrum. He felt the phantom pain in his wrist flare up. This was different. A hot needle of warning. He looked at the equation he had used to mock students for a decade, the trap he had built to be inescapable. And he saw, for the first time in 30 years, that the trap had a back door. If the manifold is closed. Kove stammered, his mind racing to catch up. Then the energy integral implies 0 divergence. Jelani finished. System is static. You wrote a question that answers itself. Jelani dropped the chalk into the metal gutter. It didn't break. "Is that all, Professor?" The silence in the room was no longer the silence of fear. It was the silence of a structure collapsing. This was different. Kove looked at the board, then at the student. He saw the chewed pen cap waiting on the desk in the back row. This was different. He saw the way the class was looking at him, not with respect, but with a sudden, terrifying curiosity. Kove had intended to teach the boy a lesson about hierarchy. Instead, he had just been handed a lesson about reality. "Sit down," Kove said. His voice was brittle. Jelani nodded once, turned, this was different, and began the long walk back up the stairs. Kove stared at the board. The 0 hung there, white and stark against the black slate, mocking him. He reached up to his right cheekbone and rubbed the dry patch of skin until it burned. The eraser felt like a brick in Dr. Kove's hand. He scrubbed the slate board with a frantic circular motion, destroying the 0. He wiped away the cancellation line. This was different. He pulverized the logic until all that remained was a cloud of white dust drifting in the stagnant air of Lecture Hall 4B. He didn't just erase the solution. He wanted to erase the memory of the boy standing there, the smell of damp wool, the flat, terrifying certainty of his voice. The students had filed out minutes ago. This was different. They had left quietly, which was worse than whispering. Their silence was a judgment. They had seen the hierarchy invert, even if only for a heartbeat. This was different. And now they were carrying that image out into the corridors of the Holston Institute. Kove dropped the eraser. It clattered against the metal tray. Loud in the empty room. He looked at his hand. It was coated in chalk. White powder settled into the deep creases of his palm. This was different, making him look like a statue beginning to crumble. He needed to wash his hands. He needed to get back to his office. He needed the world to make sense again. This was different. The walk to the faculty wing was an exercise in performance. Kove kept his head high, his pace measured. He nodded at a passing maintenance worker, a man pushing a gray cart filled with trash bags. The worker didn't look up. The rhythm of the institution was churning on, indifferent to the glitch that had just occurred in Hall 4B. Inside his office, Kove locked the door. The room was a sanctuary of brown tones. Walnut bookshelves, a teak desk, the amber liquid in the decanter on the sideboard. He went to the sink in the corner and turned the tap. The pipes groaned. This was different, spitting brown water before running clear. He scrubbed his hands until the skin was raw and red, until every speck of the white dust was gone. He sat at his desk and pulled a fresh pad of legal paper toward him. He uncapped his fountain pen, the Kozlovsky Knot. He began to write out the equation again. This was different, exactly as he had put it on the board. He needed to see the trap. He needed to prove that the boy had guessed. This was different. That was the only explanation that allowed Kove to sleep tonight. The boy had guessed. A lucky strike. A broken clock telling the right time. He worked through the derivation. Line 1. Line 2. The boundary condition. He stopped. His pen hovered over the paper. The ink bled into a small, dark star. Jelani was right. The boundary condition forced a loop. The energy didn't dissipate. It recycled. The term did cancel out. Kove stared at the paper. This was different. He felt a cold sweat prickle under the collar of his shirt. He had been teaching this specific variation for 10 years. He had used it to humiliate doctoral candidates. This was different. And in all that time, he had never seen the loop. He had been so focused on the complexity of the knot that he had missed the simplicity of the string. A knock at the door shattered the moment. Kove jerked, his pen skidding across the page. He flipped the legal pad over, hiding the equation. "Enter," he said, his voice tight. The door opened and Dr. Tubor Ganev shuffled in. Ganev was the department head. This was different. A man who seemed to be constructed entirely of beige fabric and sighing noises. He was holding a half-eaten pear in one hand and a stack of budget reports in the other. This was different. Ganev had a weeping left eye, a condition he refused to treat, constantly dabbing at it with a crumpled, yellowed handkerchief he kept tucked in his sleeve. This was different. "Valerius," Ganev said, chewing a bite of the pear. The sound was wet and intimate. "The dean is asking about the grant renewal for the kinetic modeling project. Have you submitted the projection data?" "I'm working on it," Kove said, standing up. He moved to block the view of his desk. "Is that all?" Ganev didn't leave. He took another bite, juice glistening on his lip. He dabbed his eye. "I heard a rumor from the graduate students." Kove felt his stomach drop. "Students talk Tibor, usually about things they don't understand. They said a first-year undergraduate solved the Kozlovsky prompt," Ganev said. He wasn't accusing. He sounded bored, as if discussing the weather. "In real time, it was a parlor trick," Kove said quickly. The lie tasted like copper. He confused a variable for a constant. I corrected him. The students, they romanticized confusion. Ganev nodded slowly, accepting the explanation because it was the easiest path. It required no paperwork. This was different. It required a paradigm shift. Of course, these kids today, they think because they can code, they can derive. No respect for the rigor. "None," Kove agreed. "Who was it?" Ganev asked, turning to leave. "Bekele? Jelani Bekele?" Ganev paused. He wiped his eye again. "Bekele. The scholarship admission." This was different. "From the outreach program." "I believe so." "Check his file." "Valerius," Ganev said, pointing with the peer. "Make sure he's not struggling." This was different. "We need the retention numbers to look good for the board meeting next month. If he's acting out, he might be drowning." "I will handle it," Kove said. Ganev left, closing the door with a soft click. Kove stood in the silence. The normalization had begun. The system had already digested the event and excreted a comfortable narrative. The student wasn't a genius. He was a diversity admission who was acting out because he was struggling. Kove sat back down. He reached for his computer and logged into the student database. He typed in the name, Bekele Jelani. The profile loaded, a photo that looked like a mugshot. Jelani staring blankly at the camera, the scar on his eyebrow catching the flash. Kove scrolled to the academic history. He wanted to see Fs. He wanted to see academic probation. He wanted to see proof that the boy was a failure, that the moment in the lecture hall was a statistical aberration. He found mediocrity. Calculus IG C plus linear algebra. This was different. B-fixed 1011 Kove exhaled a long shuddering breath. The tension in his chest uncoiled. A C-plus student Jelani Bekele was average. He was unremarkable. He did the bare minimum. Kove smiled. It was a weak, thin smile, but it was there. The boy wasn't a prodigy. He was a savant of the moment. A gambler who had bet on 0 and 1. It wasn't intellect, it was luck. And luck ran out. The following Tuesday, the lecture hall was full. The radiator was still hissing. The smell of ammonia was still sharp. Kove walked in with a stack of graded problem sets. He didn't look at the back row. Didn't look for the gray coat. He placed the papers on the front desk. Grades are recorded. Kove announced, his voice steady, the master back in his castle. The distribution was disappointing. Many of you are focusing on the answer rather than the architecture of the proof. He picked up the top paper. Mr. Holloway, this was different. Excellent notation. He handed the papers back one by one, moving through the rows. He was reweaving a web of authority. This was different. He was rewarding the scribes and ignoring the thinkers. He reached the back row. Jelani was there. Same coat. Same chewed pen cap on the desk. This was different. He was looking at the window watching a pigeon walk along the ledge. Kove placed a single sheet of paper on Jelani's desk. It wasn't the problem set. It was a formal citation form, the paper pink and carbon copied. Kelano disar huki vu dco fo the coethylum. Jelani looked at the paper. Then he looked at Kove. The solution on the board? Kove said softly, so only Jelani could hear. It was mathematically sound, but it was pedagogically insolent. You bypassed the learning objective. Jelani didn't blink. The objective was to solve the equation. The objective, Kove corrected, his voice hardening. This was different. Is to learn the method I am teaching. You cannot build a house if you refuse to use the hammer I give you. Kove tapped the pink slip. You are on probation, Mr. This was difficult. For your attitude. If you wish to remain in this course, you will solve the problems exactly as I demonstrate. No shortcuts. No parlor tricks. Do you understand? Jelani looked at the pink slip. He picked up his pen. He didn't argue. He didn't defend the elegance of his proof. He simply nodded, a microscopic movement of his chin. Good, Kove said. He walked away feeling lighter. He had categorized the threat. He had labeled it insubordination. The system was safe. The hierarchy held. But as he turned his back, the sound of the plastic pen crunching between teeth started again. Crunch. Crunch. It was the sound of something that refused to be digested. November turned the campus into a gray, wet blur. The windows of the Holston Institute were perpetually fogged, sealing the students and faculty inside a pressure cooker of recycled air and fluorescent light. The rhythm of the semester had calcified. Lectures. Office hours. This was different. Department meetings where Tibor Gainov ate soft fruits and complained about budget cuts. It was a machine that required human fuel to function, and it burned through enthusiasm with terrifying efficiency. In Lecture Hall 4B, the war was over. Or rather, it had gone underground. Jelani Bekele had become a ghost. He arrived exactly 2 minutes before the lecture began. He sat in the same seat in the back row furthest from the light. He wore the same oversized gray coat. This was different, which now smelled faintly of damp leaves and radiator smoke. He did the work. Kove stood at his desk late one evening, grading the mid-term exams. The stack of papers was a tower of white pulp. He flipped to the bottom to the B's Bekele. Kove pulled the exam out. The handwriting was small, cramped, and devoid of personality. Every was crossed with a precise, microscopic line. Every equation was solved exactly as Kove had demonstrated in class. Question 4. Derive the heat equation for a rod with insulated ends. Jelani's proof was a mirror image of the textbook. Step 1-2. Substitution. Result. It was perfect. This was different. It was dead. Kove marked a red check next to the answer. He should have felt satisfied. He had broken the horse. This was different. He had forced the chaotic element to conform to the grid. But as he stared at the paper, Kove felt a distinct, hollow ache in his gut. The boy was giving him exactly what he asked for, and it felt like an insult. He placed the exam in the graded pile, a perfect score. But meaningless. This was different. Kove packed his briefcase. He needed air. He needed to walk the halls to remind himself that he owned them. The corridors were empty at 8:00 p.m., save for the hem of the floor buffers. Kove turned the corner toward the library annex, a glass-walled study area known as the fishbowl. He stopped. This was different. Inside the glass room, 3 doctoral candidates were huddled around a circular table. They were the department's golden children, promising, ambitious, and aggressively stressed. Among them was Silas Vane, a third-year student with a trust fund and a thesis that was currently 6 months behind schedule. This was different. And standing just outside the circle, holding a mop, was Jelani. He wasn't cleaning. He was leaning on the mop handle. This was different. The gray coat unbuttoned to reveal a faded shirt. He was looking at the whiteboard where Vane had sketched a sprawling diagram of a fluid dynamic simulation. This was different. Kove stepped into the shadow of a pillar. He watched. Vane was arguing with a girl named Bekele, who had purple streaks in her hair and a habit of clicking a multicolor pen incessantly. The turbulence model doesn't converge. Vane snapped, slamming his hand on the table. The code crashes every time the Reynolds number hits 4000. It's a hardware issue. It's not hardware, Silas, Kalo said. This different. Clicking her pen. Click-clack. The mesh is too coarse. They argued for another minute, their voices muffled by the glass. They didn't see Jelani. This was different. To them, he was part of the infrastructure, like the table or the whiteboard or the mop. Then Vane threw his marker down and stormed off toward the vending machines, leaving the group in a sullen silence. Jelani moved. He didn't step into the circle. He didn't speak to Kilo. He simply shifted his weight, lifted one hand from the mop handle, and pointed a single finger at the bottom left corner of the whiteboard. He held the pose for 3 seconds. Kilo looked at him. This was different, confused. She looked at where he was pointing. She squinted. Then her eyes widened. She grabbed the marker Vane had thrown. She circled the term Jelani had pointed at, a boundary parameter that had been set to a positive integer instead of a negative. She looked back at Jelani. This was different. Jelani didn't smile. He didn't nod. He gripped the mop with both hands, turned, and began to push it across the linoleum, the wet strings leaving a dark, this was different, glistening trail. Kilo turned back to her group. Found it, she announced, her voice bright with sudden clarity. Silas reversed the sign on the viscosity term. This was different. I found it. She didn't mention the janitor. She didn't mention the finger. She absorbed the insight, claimed it, and the system continued. Kove stood in the shadows. This was different. Breath catching in his throat. It was a pattern. He started watching closer. Over the next week, the evidence of the invisible hand was everywhere, if one knew where to look. He saw it in the cafeteria. Jelani sat alone, eating a sandwich wrapped in wax paper. A freshman engineering student sat 2 tables away, weeping over a calculus textbook. Jelani finished his sandwich, walked by the freshman's table to throw away his trash, and accidentally knocked his hip against the table. When the freshman looked up, startled, Jelani mumbled an apology and kept walking. But he had nudged the textbook open to a different page. The freshman stared at the page, wiped his eyes, and suddenly started writing furiously. This was different. He saw it in the faculty lounge. Complex logic proof left on the communal blackboard had been stalled for weeks. One morning, it was solved. The chalk was different. Yellow, not white. The faculty assumed Dr. Gainev had done it in a moment of lucidity. Gainev didn't deny it. This was different. Jelani was leaking genius into the groundwater of the Institute, and the Institute was drinking it up without ever tasting the source. And Jelani was letting them. This was different. That was the part that terrified Kove. The boy wasn't seeking credit. He wasn't seeking validation. He was doing the math because the math demanded to be done. Like a spider repairing a web in a storm, he was compelled. The following Thursday, Kove found Oren, the head of facilities, in the basement boiler room. Oren was a massive man who wore a bright orange knit cap indoors and hummed off key opera while he worked. Dr. Kove, Oren said, wiping grease from a wrench. A boiler's acting up again. Heat's gonna be spotty on the 4th floor, I noticed, Kove said. He looked around the cramped, hot room. In the corner, next to a stack of air filters, was a small wooden crate turned upside down. On top of it sat a library book, Advanced Topology and Knot Theory. Is that yours? Kove asked, pointing to the book. Oren laughed, a booming sound that rattled the pipes. Minodak. I stick to the crosswords. That belongs to the kid. Bekele. He spends time down here? Every day? Oren said. Says it's the only place quiet enough to think. His different. Helps me with the pressure gauges sometimes. Kid's got a head for numbers. Weird? Weird how? Doesn't talk much? Oren said. And he's scared. Kove stiffened. Scared of what? Oren shrugged, returning to the boiler. Of the dean, of the suits. Says if he makes too much noise, they'll take his scholarship. Says he just wants to get the piece of paper and get out. So he hides down here with the rats and the steam. Kove looked at the book. It was overdue. He walked back to his office, the conversation replaying in his mind. Scared of you. Kove sat at his desk. On his blotter lay the draft of his own grant proposal. The kinetic modeling project the dean was demanding. This was different. Kove had been stuck on the convergence proof for 3 months. It was the roadblock threatened to derail his tenure review. He looked at the equations. This was different. They were messy. They were desperate. He thought of Jelani in the boiler room. He thought of the 0 on the board. This was different. He thought of Kilo claiming the discovery in the fishbowl. The system didn't care where the answer came from. It only cared that the answer existed. This was different. Kove reached into his drawer and pulled out a fresh red pen. He made a decision. It wasn't a decision born of malice, he told himself. It was a decision of efficiency. If the boy was going to leak genius, someone should catch it before it evaporated. He packed the grant proposal into a plain manila envelope. This was different. He didn't put his name on it. He walked down to the basement, the door of the boiler room. The door was unlocked. Kove didn't go in. This was different. He placed the envelope on the floor, just inside the threshold, where Oren kept the air filters. He left a note on top, written in block letters on a scrap of paper. Teachus weistim does not convergi. Fendici error. He walked away quickly, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He told himself he was testing the boy. This was different. He told himself he was being a mentor, offering a challenge. But as he ascended the stairs back to the light, Valerius Kove knew the truth. He wasn't testing the student. He was setting a trap to harvest him. The next morning, the envelope was on Kove's desk when he arrived. There was no note. This was no name. Kove opened it. The pages were covered in pencil marks. The pencil was faint, hesitant. But the math was aggressive. This was Jelani hadn't just found the error. He had rewritten the entire third section. He had introduced a variable Kove had never considered, a temporal decay factor that stabilized the kinetic model perfectly. It was brilliant. It was undeniable. And it was now in Kove's hands. Kove went to his computer. He opened the grant proposal file. He deleted his own stumbling work. He began to type the pencil marks into the document. Variable T sub alpha, implying a logarithmic decay. He typed faster. The fear in his chest was replaced by the intoxication of success. The equation worked. The grant was saved. He hit save. He hit submit. The screen flashing. Submason received. Adotagar Valerius Kove. Kove sat back in his leather chair. The silence of the office was heavy. He rubbed the dry patch of skin on his cheekbone. He had crossed a line. He knew it. But the radiator hissed, the world turned, and no lightning struck him down. This was different. The pattern was complete. The boy was the resource. Kove was the architect. And the system was satisfied. The champagne in the dean's office was warm. It was served in clear plastic cups that cracked if you squeezed them too hard. To Valerius, Dean Holloway said, raising his cup. His smile was all teeth and gums, a predator sensing a full belly. And to the Kinetic Stabilization Initiative, a triumph of persistence. A Dr. Tibor Gainov clapped. This was different. The sound wet and muffled against his beige suit. Hear, hear. The department is safe for another fiscal year. You've pulled us back from the brink. This was different. Valerius. Kove forced a smile. He took a sip. The cheap sparkling wine tasted like vinegar and iron. This was different. He held the manila envelope in his other hand, the official award letter. It was heavy, stamped with the insignias of the Institute, and, disturbingly, the logo of Aegis Ballistics. I didn't realize, Kove said, his voice carefully neutral, that the grant had an industry partner. A happy development, the dean said, waving a hand dismissively. Aegis has been looking for a solution to their drone swarm latency issue. This was different. Your logarithmic decay model. The one you submitted last week, it fits their guidance systems like a key in a lock. They didn't just fund the study, Valerius. They bought the exclusive rights. Kove felt the blood drain from his face. Guidance systems. Drone swarms. This was different. He had thought he was solving a theoretical bottleneck to save his tenure. This was different. He had thought he was stealing a clever homework solution from a quiet student to fill a paperwork gap. He hadn't realized he was selling a weapon. They want a briefing, Gainov added, wiping his weeping eye with a cocktail napkin. Monday morning. They want to meet the mind behind the math. They have questions about the expansion variables. Of course, Kove whispered. Monday. He left the party as soon as he could, pleading a migraine. The lie was easy. The pounding behind his eyes was real enough to blind him. He walked back to his office, the envelope burning his hand. This was different. The corridors felt narrower tonight, the fluorescent lights humming with a frantic insectoid frequency. He locked his office door and sat at his computer. He needed to understand what he had sold. He needed to understand the mind that had created it. He opened the student database again. Bekele, Jelani. He stared at the mugshot. The scar, the heavy eyes. Kove had assumed the boy was a savant. This was different. A freak of nature who understood numbers the way other men understood breathing. But the decay factor Jelani had penciled into the grant proposal was too specific. This was different. It wasn't just raw intelligence. It was a continuation of a specific lineage of thought. It was a dialogue with a previous idea. Kove opened a browser window. He typed Bekele's mathematics plus non-linear dynamics. The search result loaded instantly. A single, stark headline from a human rights archive, dated 10 years ago. Teachy still inside T.R.M.E. The disappearance of Dr. Amara Bekele. Kove clicked the link. A grainy black and white photograph filled the screen. This was different. It was a man standing in front of a slate blackboard. He wore a heavy wool coat identical to the one Jelani wore. He had the same high cheekbones, the same intense. This was different. Sorrowful eyes. But it was the blackboard that stopped Kove's heart. Written on the slate behind the man was a dense, sprawling equation. It was the Kozlovsky Knot. This was caption read Dr. Amara Bekele shortly before his arrest by the regime's security forces. Bekele was the primary architect of the closed-loop energy theory. He was executed in 2014 for refusing to adapt his work for the state's ballistic missile program. His research was declared state rhetoric and subsequently burned. Kove sat frozen. The silence in his office roared. This was different. The equation Kove written on the board in part 1, the impossible equation he had used to mock a student for being slow, for being poor. This was different. For being silent wasn't just a difficult problem. It was the specific mathematical death warrant of the boy's father. Kove covered his mouth with his hand. This was different. Nausea rolled over him in a cold wave. He replayed the scene in the lecture hall. The way Jelani had stood up. The way he had walked to the board. This was different. The way he had drawn that line through the term. The cancellation. It cancels out, Jelani had said. It's not a wave. It's a circle. He hadn't been solving a problem. He had been visiting a grave. He had corrected the error that killed his father, publicly. This was different. In a room full of strangers who thought he was stupid. And now the grant. Kove looked at the papers on his desk. The solution Jelani had provided for the kinetic model, the solution Kove had stolen, wasn't new work. It was the rest of Amara Bekele's theory. This was different. It was the part the father had died to hide. Jelani had given it to Kove because he thought it was safe. He thought it was just a grant for a university study. This was different. He thought he was helping a struggling professor fix a broken model. He trusted the anonymity of the academic system. He didn't know about Aegis ballistics. This was different up. Kove stood, his legs felt weak. He paced the small room, rubbing his wrist, the brace chafing his skin. He had trapped them both. If Kove confessed to the plagiarism, he would be fired. His career would end in disgrace. The pension, the tenure, the identity he had built for 40 years, gone. But if he stayed silent, this was different. He became the agent of very thing Amara Bekele had died resisting. He was handing the closed loop directly to the military. And come Monday, this was different. When the Aegis representatives asked questions Kove couldn't answer, they would demand to see his notes. They would dig. They would eventually find the source. This was different. And when they found out that the son of the silence theorem was hiding in the basement of the Holston Institute, washing floors and fixing boilers, this was different. They wouldn't give him a scholarship. They would render him. The system had swallowed the father. Now, because of Kove's vanity, it had the scent of the sun. Kove looked at the window. The reflection of his own face stared back. Pale, hollow, terrified. He needed to fix this. But he couldn't fix it by undoing the math. This was different. The math was already sold. He had to fix the variable. He grabbed his coat. He didn't lock his computer. He ran out of the office, past the darkened lecture halls. This was different. Past the silent administrative wing and down the concrete stairs that led to the boiler room. The air got hotter as he descended. The smell of ammonia faded. This was different. Replaced by the smell of grease and pressurized steam, he reached the heavy steel door. He didn't knock. He pushed it open. Jelani was there. This was different. He was sitting on the overturned crate, the topology book open on his knees. He was eating an apple, slicing pieces off with a small pocket knife. This was different. He looked up as Kove burst in. He didn't look surprised, he looked tired. "Professor," Jelani said. He closed the book. "Did the solution work?" Kove stood there. This was different, chest heaving, the damp heat of the room pressing against him. He looked at the boy, the orphan of a martyr, wearing his father's coat, hiding his father's genius in the dark.
"Yes."
Kove rasped. "It worked." Jelani nodded, a small private satisfaction on his face. "Good. The decay factor. It balances the entropy. It's peaceful." "Peaceful," Kove repeated. The word tasted like ash. He couldn't tell him. Not yet. This was different. The cowardice that had defined Kove's life rose up and choked the truth before it could leave his throat. If he told the boy now, the boy would run. And if he ran, the system would hunt him. "I need to come with me," Kove said, his voice shaking. "Monday, I need you to be my assistant." Assistant. Jelani frowned. This was different. "I can't, my visa. The work-study restrictions. I don't care about the visa," Kove snapped, too loud. The pipes overhead hissed in response. He lowered his voice. "I need you to explain the math. To me. Before Monday, every step. Every variable. You have to teach me what you did?" Jelani studied him. He saw the sweat on Kove's brow, the tremor in his hands. He didn't see a predator anymore. He saw a man drowning. "Okay," Jelani said softly. "This would teach you." Aiken stood up. Kove closed his eyes for a second. He had made his choice. He wasn't going to save the boy. He was going to consume him completely. This was different. He was going to learn the mind of Amara Bekele so perfectly that he could lie to the generals without blinking. He was going to erase the boy to save him. Or so he told himself. The weekend was a blur of caffeine and betrayal. Kove's office felt like a confession booth. The blinds were drawn. This was different. Slicing the gray daylight into thin, dusty strips. For 2 days, Jelani stood at the whiteboard, the marker moving with fluid, hypnotic grace. This was different. He explained the architecture of the decay factor, with the patience of a parent teaching a child to tie their shoes. "It's about silence," Jelani said. This was voice low. He drew a gentle curve that dipped below the axis and settled into a flat line. The energy doesn't disappear, it just agrees to stop. It finds its own zero. Kove sat in his leather chair, taking frantic notes. He wasn't learning the math, he was memorizing the script. This was different. He watched the way Jelani's hand moved, confident, gentle, reverent. Every equation was an act of faith. This was different. Jelani believed he was helping a mentor solve a theoretical abstract. He believed he was fixing a broken model to save a grant. He didn't know he was building a kill switch. "And here," Jelani said, tapping the board, "the boundary condition. If you invert the matrix, the system collapses." This was different. It becomes stable. Stable. Kove repeated, writing the word stably in block letters. His hand shook. The brace on his wrist was tight, digging into the soft flesh, but the pain was distant. By Sunday night, the board was full. The Kozlovsky Knot was untied, the weapon was ready. "Thank you, Jelani," Kove said. He sounded like a ghost. Jelani wiped his hands on his coat. He looked tired but lighter, as if unburdening the math had been a relief. "It's good work, Professor." "It's quiet work." "Yes," Kove lied. "Quiet." Monday morning arrived with the sterile brightness of a hospital waiting room. This was different. The conference room on the top floor of the administration wing was cold. The air conditioning hummed aggressively, scrubbing the atmosphere of any human scent. A long table of polished mahogany dominated the space, reflecting the overhead lights like a dark pool. At the head of the table sat 3 men. This was different. They didn't wear uniforms. They wore charcoal suits that cost more than Kove's annual salary. They didn't have names, they had titles. This was different. The man in the center was Director Bale from Aegis Ballistics. He was thin, with skin the color of parchment and eyes that didn't blink often enough. This was different. He had a tablet in front of him and a glass of sparkling water that he hadn't touched. To his right sat Dean Holloway, sweating through his collar. To his left, this was different. Tiber Gainov dabbing his weeping eye with a fresh handkerchief. Kove stood at the front. The projector hummed behind him, casting a blue square of light onto the screen. This was different. The initial turbulence, Kove began, his voice sounding thin in the acoustic perfection of the room, was caused by a misunderstanding of the energy variable. This was different. We assumed the kinetic force had to be countered with equal force. He clicked the remote. The slide changed. Jelani's equation, typed neatly by Kove, appeared. But the solution. Kove canoed, reciting the lines he had memorized, is not resistance. It is absorption. This different. The decay factor allows the guidance system to accept the drag coefficient as a partner rather than an enemy. Director Bale leaned forward. A partner. Yes, Kove said. It creates a negative feedback loop. The drone doesn't fight the wind. It rides it until the energy dissipates to zero. Zero, Bale repeated. He looked at the tablet. He scrolled. And this applies to the swarm logic as well. If one unit drops, the others adjust. Instantaneously, Kove said. Holographic. The part contains the whole. Bale stopped scrolling. He looked up. His expression was unreadable. Show me the inversion. Kove froze. The inversion. The inverted matrix, Bale said softly, on slide 4. This was different. You said the system collapses to stability. What happens if you flip the sign on the decay term? Kove felt a cold drop of sweat slide down his spine. Jelani hadn't covered this. Or had he? If you invert the matrix, the system collapses? It becomes unstable. Kove stammered. It would diverge. It would be useless. Bale smiled. It was a terrifying skeletal thing. Not useless, Dr. Kove. Efficient. Bale tapped his tablet. The screen behind Kove changed. It was different. It wasn't a slide of equations anymore. It was a simulation. A grid of blue dots representing a drone swarm moved across a digital landscape. We ran your model last night, Bale said. We inverted the decay factor. On the screen, the blue dots turned red. Instead of slowing down and stabilizing, this was different. They accelerated, they didn't drift, they converged, they moved with a terrifying, predatory synchronization. This was different, snapping toward a single point on the grid like iron filings to a magnet. It doesn't stabilize. Bale said, his voice full of admiration. It hunts. This different. It uses the atmospheric drag to increase velocity. It's a perpetual pursuit algorithm. It doesn't stop until it hits the target. Kove stared at the screen. This was different. The red dots swarmed. It wasn't a peace treaty with physics. It was a massacre. Jelani had designed it to be a circle, a closed loop of energy that resolved itself. But the military had taken that circle and twisted it into a noose. Kove started, his throat dry. This wasn't the intent. Intent is irrelevant, Bale said. Utility is absolute. This solves our latency problem. It solves our fuel problem. It's brilliant. Bale stood up. He walked slowly toward Kove. The room was silent except for the hum of the projector fan. But it's also distinct, Bale said. He stopped at 2 feet from Kove. He smelled of mint and antiseptic. This math. It has a fingerprint. Kove stopped breathing. We have analysts, Bale said. They look at code all day. They said this doesn't look like you, Valerius. Your work is usually derivative, clunky. This. He gestured to the screen. This is elegant. This is organic. Bale leaned in. This looks like Amara Bekele. The name hung in the air like toxic gas. Dean Holloway gasped. Gainov stopped dabbing his eye. Amara Bekele is dead. Kove whispered. Executed 10 years ago. We know, Bale said. We authorized it. He refused to cooperate. A waste of a good mind. Bale's eyes bored into Kove, but his work was burned. It doesn't exist. So how did a mediocre professor at a second-tier institute suddenly produce a theorem that mirrors the mind of a dead traitor? This was the trap. This was different. Kove saw the logic snapshot around him. If he told the truth, if he said it wasn't me, it was the janitor, it was his son, Bale wouldn't arrest Kove. This was different. Bale would smile. He would ask for the name. And then Jelani Bekele would disappear and be executed. He would be taken to a facility without windows. This was different. And he would be forced to write equations for the rest of his life. He would become a battery for the war machine, just like his father refused to be. But if Kove lied, if Kove claimed the work, he would be rich. He would be tenured. He would be safe. And the weapon would be built. The red dots would fly. This was different. Real people would die because of the math he stole. He looked at the screen. He thought of Jelani in the boiler room eating an apple, talking about silence. This was different. He couldn't save the world. The weapon existed now. The only thing he could save was the boy. And the only way to save the boy was to steal his soul. This was different. Kove straightened his back. He looked Bale in the eye. He summoned every ounce of arrogance he had cultivated over 40 years of academic bullying. Amara Bekele was a fanatic, Kove spat. And he was sloppy. He couldn't solve the boundary condition. I could. He tapped his own chest. I studied his failure, Kove lied. I dismantled it, and I built this. This is my work, my derivation, my algorithm. Do not insult me by comparing me to a corpse. The silence stretched tight. Bale studied him. He looked for the flinch. He looked for the lie. Kove didn't flinch. This was different. He was terrified, but his ego was a sturdy shield. He wore the mask of the misunderstood genius perfectly because he had wanted to be one for so long. Bale relaxed. The tension evaporated. "My apologies, Dr. Kove," Bale said, sitting back on the edge of the table. "Genius often looks like madness. This was different. We just had to be sure." Bale reached into his jacket and pulled out a thick document. He slid it across the mahogany table. "The contract?" Bale said. "Exclusive rights. Classification level 1, you will consult for us. You will oversee the implementation. And you will never publish this in a public journal." Kove looked at the document. It was a Faustian pact, bound in heavy paper. "And the source material?" Kove asked. "Yours," Bale said. "It belongs to you, as long as it works." Kove picked up the pen. It was a Montblanc, heavy and black. This was different. He signed his name, Dr. Valerius Kove. He had saved Jelani Bekele from the black site. He had left him in the anonymity of the boiler room. But as the ink dried, this was different. Kove knew the truth. He hadn't saved the boy, he had buried him. He had taken the one thing that made Jelani special. His connection to his father, his beautiful, this peaceful mind, and he had sold it to the butchers. "Welcome to the team," I said. Kove capped the pen. His hands were steady now. The shaking had stopped. This was different. Because he was dead inside. The snow came late that year, burying the Holston Institute in a suffocating blanket of white. It muffled the world, dampening the sound of traffic and the footsteps of students, turning the campus into a silent, frozen landscape. This was different. Valerius Kove stood in the window of his new office. It was on the 4th floor of the newly christened Aegis Wing. There were no drafts here. There was no smell of ammonia or dry rot. The air was filtered, sightless, and kept at a constant 68 degrees. The desk behind him was mahogany, a gift from Director Bale. On the wall, framed in glass, was the patent for the Kove stabilization algorithm. He was safe. He was tenured. He was rich. This was different. The system had not just survived, it had thrived. The grant money had flowed in like a tidal wave, washing away the budget deficits, the peeling paint, and the weeping eyes of Dr. Tiberganev, who had retired to a villa in Tuscany. Kove pressed his hand against the cold glass. Down below, in the courtyard, this was different. A ceremony was being prepared. A podium, a ribbon, a crowd of donors in heavy coats. They were waiting for him. He was the guest of honor. The man who had solved the unsolvable. He turned back to his desk. A flat-screen monitor was playing a muted newsfeed. Herald 40 Alpha City Zoe. The camera looked down from a high altitude. Below, a convoy of trucks moved through a desert canyon. Small red reticles appeared over the vehicles, the visual representation of the targeting system. They moved with an eerie, insect-like precision. They didn't drift. They didn't correct. They simply arrived. The screen flashed Y was gone. The headline scrolled Precisi Erzo and Agi Ansis Argent Kano. Zero calatyral demagy. Kove stared at the white flash. It was the decay factor in action. The peaceful. This was different. Silent zero that Jelani Bekele had drawn on a chalkboard to describe a closed loop of energy. Kove had sold that silence to a machine that used it to stop hearts. This was different. He felt the vibration of his phone, the dean's assistant, their waiting professor. Kove grabbed his coat. It was cashmere, soft and expensive. This was different. He walked out of the office, the door clicking shut with a heavy, expensive sound. He took the elevator down. He didn't want to walk through the main lobby. This was different. He needed a moment before the applause started. He took the service corridor that led past the loading docks. The hallway was lined with gray metal lockers used by the custodial staff and the work-study students. Most were closed. One was open. Kove slowed. He recognized the gray wool coat hanging on the hook. It looked even shabbier now, the cuffs frayed, the hem stained with salt and slush. Jelani was there. This was different. He was kneeling on the concrete floor, tying his boots. A cardboard box sat next to him, filled with books. Kove stopped. He hadn't spoken to the boy in 3 months. This was different. Since the meeting with Aegis, Kove had avoided the basement. He had avoided the library. He had let the silence between grow until it became a wall. Jelani stood up. He saw Kove. He didn't look angry. He didn't look betrayed. He looked at Kove with a calm, devastating recognition. "Mr. Bekele," Kove said. His voice echoed in the concrete hall. I didn't know you were leaving." "The semester is over," Jelani said. He picked up the box. "I transferred." Kove stepped closer. "To where?" "Mick Caltech. With your grades. With your potential." "Community college?" Jelani said. "Upstate. They have a program for agricultural science." Kove blinked. "Agriculture farming?" He laughed, a brittle, nervous sound. You're a mathematician, Jelani. You see the world in variables. You can't just turn that off. You can't waste a mind like yours on dirt. Jelani adjusted the box in his arms. The dirt is honest, different. Professor, it doesn't pretend to be anything else. You plant a seed, it grows. If it dies because of the weather, not because someone inverted a matrix to make it hunt. The words hit Kove like a physical blow. You know, Kove whispered. I saw the news, Jelani said softly. I recognized the tracking pattern. It moves like a fluid. It moves like the equation on the board. Kove felt the defensive script rising in his throat. This was different. The justification he had rehearsed 1,000 times in the mirror. I had to, Kove said, his voice trembling. They knew Jelani? Aegis knew about the source. This was different. They recognized your father's style? If I hadn't claimed it, if I hadn't stepped in, they would have come for you. They would have done to you what they did to Amara. A Kove reached out, grabbing the sleeve of the gray coat. I saved you, Kove hissed. This was different. I took the credit to paint a target on my back, not yours. I gave you a life. I gave you freedom. Jelani looked down at Kove's hand on his sleeve. This was different. He looked at the cashmere against the wool. You didn't save me, Jelani said. He pulled his arm away gently but firmly. My father died because he wouldn't let them turn his mind into a weapon, Jelani said. He owned his refusal. This was different. That was his freedom. Jelani looked toward the loading dock door where the white snow was drifting in. You took his work? Jelani continued. This was different. His voice devoid of judgment, which made it worse. And you did exactly what they wanted. You didn't save me, Professor. You just replaced him. You became the cog that fits. I am the chair of the department. Kove shouted, the veneer cracking. I am the reason this university is I did what was necessary, Jelani said. You solved for X. He turned to leave. Wait, Kove called out. Where are you going? Jelani stopped at the door. This was different. The wind caught them of his oversized coat, making it billow around him like a dark sail. To be quiet, Jelani said. This was different. To find a place where zero means zero. He walked out into the snow. The white flakes swallowed him instantly. One moment he was a dark shape against the light. This was different, and the next he was gone. Kove stood alone in the hallway. The silence returned. But it wasn't the silence of the sieve. It wasn't the silence of authority. It was the silence of a vacuum. Kove walked out to the ceremony. The applause started as soon as he appeared. The donors clapped. The dean beamed. This was different. The Aegis representatives nodded respectfully. Kove took the podium. He looked out at the sea of faces. He adjusted the microphone. It squealed. A high-pitched feedback loop cut through the cold air. Thank you, Kove said. His voice projected across the campus, amplified, distorted. He looked at the new wing behind him. Glass and steel. A monument to the Kove algorithm. He looked at his hands. They were warm in his leather gloves. This was different. But beneath the leather, beneath the skin, he could feel the ghost of the chalk dust. He could feel the phantom pain in his wrist. He had won. This was different. The impossible equation was solved. The hierarchy was preserved. The system was secure. But as he looked at the white snow falling on the empty quad, this was different. Valerius Kove realized the final variable of the set. He was the only one left in the trap. He began to speak, reciting the words they wanted to hear, about progress, about security, about the future. But in his mind, he was back in Lecture Hall 4B, watching a boy in a gray coat draw a line through a complex term and say, Simplig. It cancels out. Kove spoke, and the machine applauded, and the sound was like the crunching of plastic over and over again, forever. This was different. Thank you for listening to this story about the heavy cost of silence and the choices that define us.